Hello, this is Josh from Once Upon a Dribble coming back to you today with sort of a side series, short kind of episodic entries that I like to call Once Upon a Dribble Notebook, where for 20 to 30 minutes, I kind of just spitball some ideas on things that I've been thinking about in regards to the basketball world and then try to contextualize them, within the realm of what basketball history is, which of course lines up with what we are here at Once Upon a Dribble, which is basketball history. So today's episode, I wanted to talk specifically about what heliocentricity actually means and what we get wrong about that as basketball fans. Heliocentric gets used as kind of this shorthand for ball dominance, but within the context of NBA history, it describes something that's much more specific, which to me is gravitational offense, not necessarily selfish play. You know, we kind of throw heliocentric around as a criticism these days, often used to kind of flatten very different players into one label. This term does generally imply everything revolving around one body, around one player, but how that happens has changed across eras, has changed across NBA history. And to understand what heliocentric really means, we have to rewind not to Luka or to Harden, but to how NBA offenses were originally structured, even back in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. So I want to start with what's called the Pre-Heliocentric Era, which is the systems that came before the stars. Early NBA offense was not heliocentric by design. A lot of NBA offenses flowed through their stars and not necessarily around them and what they did with their decision making. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you had a lot of motion, you had a lot of post entries, a lot of kind of read and react, where these stars, these all-time names definitely existed, but offenses weren't built to orbit them continuously. The first name that comes to mind for me, and probably for a lot of people, is Wilt Chamberlain, where, Wilt's the best example of why usage alone doesn't necessarily make an offense heliocentric. When people think of Wilt, they think of ball hog, they think of all-time usage, and they think of him as this heliocentric prototype. And yes, Wilt was massive usage, but not constant on-ball creation. Because with Wilt, he finished possessions more than created them. The offense for Philadelphia, San Francisco, wherever he was, especially during his prime, usually ended with Wilt rather than kind of run through him. And a lot of this has to do with, of course, different rules from the day, different play styles, different philosophies. But in 1962, Wilt famously averages 50.4 points per game, 25.7 rebounds, and then a hilarious 2.4 assists. But even more famously, he did that playing 48 and a half minutes per game, which is not a typo. He played every single game, including a couple overtime games. And the thing is, even when you prorate those numbers down to per 36 minutes, it's still an insane 37 and 19 stat line. But despite these ludicrous numbers, that didn't necessarily mean a lot of on-ball orchestration from Wilt. Assist numbers for Wilt would spike massively later in his career when he revamped his game. That first spike came in 1967 when he averaged a very impressive 7.8 assists per game, namely because new Philadelphia coach Alex Hannum pled with Wilt to revamp his approach and mindset, and not coincidentally in 1967, Philadelphia wins the championship. Even then, offenses weren't structured around repeated advantage creation through Wilt Chamberlain. He was more of kind of this black hole that sucked in everything rather than him being kind of the sun where everything orbited around him. The next player that comes to mind is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And Kareem is what offensive gravity looked like before spacing existed. Because Kareem did bend defenses in a way that we had never seen before. But of course, he did that without modern heliocentric mechanics. When people think of Kareem, they think of his famous skyhook, which was an automatic advantage back in the day. Teams were frequently forced to double team Kareem because at 7'2", 230 pounds, he had this mix of size, mobility, and shooting touch that made him this unprecedented weapon. Bob Cousy, who actually coached Cincinnati when Kareem was in Milwaukee, talked about how they would try to alternate double teaming Kareem from behind or from the front, depending on the game situation. And the tactic was to throw bodies at Kareem and then force his teammates to take advantage of that kind of dynamic, which is one reason why Milwaukee was sort of unable to sustain success as the 70s wore on around Kareem, because they only won one championship around Kareem. But when you're relying on your less reliable supporting cast, you're going to get some more volatile results. But with those Bucks teams, help defense would collapse inward and not outward, because 5-out spacing wasn't a thing back then. In some seasons, the Bucks were able to punish opponents for collapsing, and others they couldn't. But Kareem's gravity was positional, whereas modern heliocentric gravity is more dynamic. And again, yes, Kareem's usage was high, but for him, assists and playmaking were secondary and often reactionary. Of course, you get some later Laker offenses when he moved to Los Angeles that did rely on multiple decision makers, especially with Magic's arrival in the late 70s, early 80s, which naturally would only reduce Kareem's on-ball burden. And I will say, to Kareem's everlasting credit, he wins MVPs, he wins championships before heliocentrism is ever viable. And then the last player I want to mention in this kind of pre-heliocentric era, more for contrast than anything, is Bill Russell. This was, of course, a defense-first, egalitarian offensive approach with the Celtics in the 60s. And he's this sort of counterexample to all of this modern thinking. The 60s Celtics were offense by committee, with defense as this kind of organizing and galvanizing principle. And Bill Russell is a connector on those offenses. He's not even an initiator. He's not a finisher. He's a connector. And, of course, I'm biased as a Celtics fan. I think Bill Russell has so many skills that are overlooked by the modern fan. His outlet passing, his quick decision making, screen setting, all things that kind of kept offense moving for the Celtics. But that said, he never dominated usage, he never controlled possession tempo, and he never dictated late clock offense. For example, the 1962 Celtics, who are, in my opinion, Bill Russell's best team, had 6 guys average double digits in scoring and very nearly a 7th player average in double digits, as Coach Red's philosophy was predictability will kill you in the playoffs. So the key thing for this pre-heliocentric era is that usage does not equal heliocentrism. And just because you get a lot of touches does not mean you have gravity. So when people retroactively call Wilt or Kareem heliocentric, they're sort of projecting a modern idea backwards. And yes, those players were dominant. They're all-time players, but the offense wasn't really designed to recalculate through those players on every single possession. And that sort of idea, that principle, only becomes possible when spacing, rules, and playmaking all converge into one. Now, I want to look at the first true heliocentric prototypes in the 80s and 90s. Heliocentric offense didn't really emerge because stars got better. It sort of came to be because the league slowly started to realize that some players could handle the decision-making load of an entire offense. Because for decades, coaches believed that the more predictable your offense became, the easier it was to solve in a 7-game playoff series, which is, of course, every coach's nightmare. So the NBA spent years just actively designing these systems to limit how much gravity one player could have. That is, until one Magic Johnson came along. And Magic is the first player where the offense didn't just run through him, it kind of flowed through all of the decisions that he would make. And this is an early example of gravity, decision gravity specifically, where it's different from Kareem. It's different from Wilt. Because the thing with Magic is that he never dominated with his scoring, and his usage wasn't even that crazy. Believe it or not, he only finished in the top 20 in any given season in usage percentage once in his entire career, and that was in 1987. Now, there's no perfect way to statistically capture this sort of principle for previous eras with what we have available. If you go to Basketball Reference, their stat usage percentage under the advanced box score section simply captures if a player takes a shot, gets fouled, or turns it over. So basically, did a player use up a possession? And that does not take into account assists. So if we look at assist percentage, Magic was top 3 every year from 1984 to 1991, and that checks out. Because with Magic, every action with the Lakers is downstream of his reads. And this is one of the first times where the ball is actually expected to come back to the star and where secondary actions exist because of Magic's vision. You have Lakers cutting, relocating, and screening, all anticipating Magic's choices. And yes, the Lakers still had Kareem's post ups. You still had James Worthy ISOs. You still had their transition chaos. But in the half court, Magic was the anchor. So the distinction for me is that Magic wasn't the sun because he held the ball, but rather because everyone else kind of moved based on where he might put it and what he might do with it. Now, for the other player that comes to mind is Michael Jordan, of course, namely in the late 80s before he started winning championships in the 90s. Late 80s Jordan is kind of the moment where the league realized that pure heliocentrism could be unstoppable in certain cases, but also unsustainable. And this is kind of where the resistance to the idea came from with MJ. Late 80s Jordan had this scoring gravity that was overwhelming because MJ could initiate, he could isolate, he could finish, and then he could, of course, bail out possessions. By 1989, he's averaging 32.5 points per game, which leads the league. He leads the league in field goal attempts for that year. He averages 8 assists per game, which is 10th. And then his usage percentage, again, if he uses up a possession with a shot, free throws, or a turnover, was 32.1, which of course led the entire league. Jordan is scoring and using up possessions at this absurd volume. At the same time, he's improving as a passer, and Chicago's offense increasingly starts to default to what does Jordan do? And the thing is, Chicago didn't necessarily want this by design. They kind of did it by necessity until Scottie Pippen got better and they got some more help around MJ. And I'll say this, the league and coaches panicked and pushed back, especially after they saw Jordan's Bulls losing the playoffs to the Celtics and to the Pistons year after year. They were scared that this one-man dependency would kind of make teams fall short, the fatigue, the defensive loading, the playoff counters. And with the Bulls, heliocentrism through MJ obviously raised the floor. They were still good teams. They were 50-plus win teams that would, win a playoff round or two. But the ceiling might be lower in any given series, and we saw that bear out, of course, until the triangle offense came in as a sort of anti-heliocentric design where it wasn't built to maximize MJ. It was kind of built to protect him from himself where, that the triangle offense forces the ball to move. It creates multiple reads. It prevents possessions from always collapsing into these Jordan isolations. And that's when Jordan's championships come. After his heliocentrism is partially restrained, because of course everything still flows through him and there might be game situations or season situations where he's more heavily relied upon. But it's not a coincidence that those championships come after the heliocentrism is restrained to at least some degree, or at least it's not at its absolute peak. So Magic in this era proves that heliocentrism could be a beautiful thing. Jordan proved that it could be an overwhelming thing. And the league's response to this was to spend basically the next decade trying to limit how much offense could orbit around one single player. And this is where we kind of step into modern heliocentrism, where it's about creation load and not necessarily ball time. Because when people talk about heliocentrism today, they focus on how long a player holds the ball. But that, in my opinion, kind of misses the point. What actually matters is who carries the responsibility of creating these advantages, who's initiating offense, reading the defense, creating the advantage, and deciding how that advantage gets used. And this takes us to LeBron James as this sort of bridge between system basketball and modern heliocentrism. In his early Cleveland years, this was what I call necessity-based heliocentrism, because the offense wasn't heliocentric because LeBron wanted it to be or demanded it to be. It was because the Cavs literally didn't have any other way to create advantages consistently. They had a weak offensive infrastructure, they had limited spacing, they had few secondary creators, and that bore out in the way that LeBron approached the game in those early Cleveland years. Whereas we go to Miami, and it's more selective heliocentrism, where LeBron reduces kind of his raw ball dominance because he's able to share creation with Dwayne Wade, and uses more of his off-ball gravity through, he's a fantastic cutter, especially in his Miami days, post seals, transition. And don't get me wrong, he still takes a fairly large percentage of Miami shots naturally as their best player and scorer. But the way in which they came and the way in which Miami's offense functioned was different than in his early Cleveland days. Now, I'll say as Dwayne Wade got older, and especially as the playoffs wore on for the Heat, they would largely resort to depending wholly upon LeBron. But for large chunks of the Heat regular seasons, especially earlier in his tenure there, it was more selective heliocentrism. So overall, the offense could run without him for stretches, but in high leverage moments, everything's still calculated through LeBron. And then in his later Cleveland and then his Laker years, you have this sort of refined control where here it's about pace control, shot diet manipulation, late game orchestration. And here he's doing a lot of dominating decisions and not just the possession. So LeBron wasn't heliocentric because he held the ball. He was heliocentric because every action depended on his read. And in his case, it's hard to argue with the results. He won a championship with every team he's played for. Team success, individual success, you name it. And now this takes us to some classic modern examples. I'm talking James Harden, Luka Doncic, and Nikola Jokic. And I want to contrast these three players. With James Harden, we have what I call maximum load. And this is what happens when you push heliocentrism to its absolute limits. The ball dominance is high because the creation load for those Rocket teams at his peak was enormous. Harden was asked to initiate, break down defenders, finish or pass, and then rinse and repeat every single possession. And if you go to Basketball Index, naturally Harden at his peak was in the near 100th percentile in a lot of usage metrics like true usage, which does take into account assists and passes, ball dominance, and offensive load. And for Harden and his Rockets teams, this did raise the regular season floor. Harden's Rockets would win between 53 and 65 games every year from 2014 to 2019, except for 1 year. But it did compress their playoff margins. And that's kind of the knock on those James Harden-led teams. Then for Luka, you have some more late clock orchestration and more matchup hunting. Slow tempo is a very common theme with Luka-led teams. Starting in his rookie year, his teams were 20th, 18th, 24th, 30th, 28th, 6th in 2024, which is the one outlier. And then slow again for his half Mavs, half Lakers year last season. And then this season, the Lakers are 21st in pace at the time of this recording. And for Luka teams, it's all about late clock advantage creation. Now, the difference from Harden is that Luka's heliocentrism is more built on situational dominance. It's less about rhythm. It's more about control. Because with Harden, he'll relentlessly bend the game every single minute that he's on the floor, while Luka will tend to bend the game more at moments when the defenses are most vulnerable. And then kind of on the other side of the spectrum compared to these guys is Jokic, where you have more of this off-ball heliocentrism with handoffs, a lot of short roll gravity. And Joker is this case that's interesting where he proves that, heliocentrism doesn't require ball dominance necessarily. And of course, not everyone's able to replicate what Jokic does. He's a one of one. But I was looking at his usage metrics, and they're interesting because during his peak, essentially since 2019, which is his first All-NBA season, he's top of the league in true usage percentage. Again, that includes passing and assists. He's anywhere between the 95th and 99th percentile in true usage, yet he's only ever been between the 76th and 85th percentile in ball dominance, which is strictly how much is the ball in your hands. So with him, he's finishing and utilizing a lot of what Denver does with their offense, but he does it without holding onto the ball that much. The touches are short, the decisions are instant, and the gravity is there even when he doesn't shoot. It's a lot of kind of anticipatory actions. So with LeBron, he showed that heliocentrism could be flexible. Harden showed that you could maximize it. Luka showed that you could control it. And then Jokic showed that it could be completely invisible. And in my opinion, what separates LeBron historically, and a reason why a lot of people have him as the greatest player of all time or in the top two, isn't that he played heliocentric basketball all the time. It's that he could turn it on, turn it off, and sort of reshape it depending on what the moment required and what his team needed. So now I want to move to finish things off. I want to move into the kind of the current state of heliocentrism. Now, I was thinking about this. I was like, if heliocentrism is really taking over the league, you'd expect to see more and more players carrying these extreme self-creation burdens. But interestingly, one of the cleanest indicators of that, which is unassisted field goals, has actually declined in recent seasons. Now, I will say unassisted field goals doesn't strictly define heliocentrism by itself, but it does highlight something important about how offenses have changed in the last couple of years. There's this awesome trend analyzed by an account on X, by an account called Emiliano, that looked at how in the mid to late 2010s, it was common to see upwards of 17, 18 players per season self-create 70% or more of their made field goals. But in recent seasons, that number has dropped sharply. Whereas today, it's basically just the true elite and a couple of outliers that create their own offense. I'm talking, SGA, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, James Harden still, Luka Doncic remain up there, unsurprisingly, given their roles. But what's striking is that it's who isn't kind of in this tier anymore. And the real disappearance with these high usage guys is these microwave guys off the bench. It's your Aaron Brooks, it's your Brandon Knights, it's your Jarrett Jacks, because in the 2000s and early 2010s, a lot of bench guards were often given total offensive autonomy. Their job was simple. It was to, come in, dominate the ball, manufacture points, your Lou Williams, your Jamal Crawfords. And those players frequently would clear 70% unassisted field goals made and function as these sort of temporary suns for second units on teams. And now teams don't really do that anymore. Spacing and shooting are just too valuable to let one guard stall offense. Ball movement for a lot of these second units today raises the lineup floors, especially when you have mixed units. And then the last reason is decision-making is now distributed pretty evenly, even amongst bench groups. And the idea is that modern offenses would rather prefer to be coherent rather than explosive with these points and everything. Now, another thing I want to mention quickly is what people get wrong. I want to name 3 misconceptions that people have with heliocentrism. Misconception number 1 is that heliocentric means bad basketball. One of the most common reactions to heliocentric offense is aesthetic. People say it's ugly, that it's stagnant, that it's not real basketball. Whereas historically, that's just blatantly not true. In fact, most championship teams have some form of heliocentric gravity. Jordan in late game bowl situations, LeBron in every title run, Steph as kind of movement-based heliocentrism, and then of course Jokic today. The second misconception is that ball dominance equals selfishness. Ball dominance, for a lot of people, especially on social media, is often interpreted as a personality trait. This guy wants to hold on to the ball, he wants to get his shots, he wants to get his stats. Whereas historically, it's generally more often a diagnosis of the state of the roster. Because if you look at any given high ball dominant season over the course of NBA history, it usually comes because of weak spacing, limited creators on the roster, or unstable lineups. And the ball will often stick with some of these guys because it literally has nowhere else to go. If the ball keeps coming back to one player, it's usually because that player is the safest decision and not necessarily the most selfish one. Now, I will say there are point blank some extremely selfish NBA players throughout NBA history who are just grating to watch, clearly not winning basketball. But I'd say for the most part, people do kind of equate ball dominance with selfishness when that isn't necessarily always the case. Again, I'm talking like Harden era Rockets, some late Kobe Laker teams, early LeBron Cavs, where there isn't really any other option. The last misconception I want to mention is you can't win playing like this. The idea that you can't win with heliocentric offense sounds right to a lot of people until you, again, look at the history where you can win like that. The margins are thinner. The more egalitarian your approach is, naturally your margins are going to expand. With higher creation burden, you get more fatigue, you get fewer bailout options, you have less room for off nights. And in a playoff series, defenses are able to adapt to you. You can get countered easier. Predictability can get punished. So, like I've said before, heliocentrism absolutely raises your floor in the hands of an elite player, but it can lower your margin for error. So you can win, but that's why I'd say the best versions of heliocentrism are situational and not, constant. Every game, every night, every single minute. It's being able to kind of have it in your toolbox more than anything. So, to put a bow on everything, the rise and fall of heliocentrism kind of makes for this catchy phrase, but the truth is a lot more interesting. Heliocentrism over the years has simply kind of been refined by NBA offenses. From, Wilt and Kareem to Magic and Jordan to LeBron, Harden, Luka, Jokic. The league has spent decades negotiating the same question, which is, how much should one player matter? And I'll say the modern NBA hasn't moved away from stars, quite the opposite. It's just gotten better at deciding when to orbit those players. This is Josh at Once Upon a Dribble, and we'd love to hear from you. What do you think about heliocentrism? Is it a good tactic? Is it something that should be utilized all the time? What do you think about the state of where heliocentrism is today in the NBA? Do you have any other historical examples that I missed? We'd love to kind of start up a conversation on this and hear more about what you have to say. But until next time, until our next entry in this Once Upon a Dribble notebook series, this is Josh signing out.